Hey everybody, welcome back once again to another edition of the Voice of Camp Nathanael, right here on the campus of Camp Nathanael in Emelina, Kentucky, and it is June the 15th. Stephen Bell, and with me is
Lee Sharp.
Lee. We've officially had a week of camp by this point.
We have. We've finished up day camp. We got through orientation and then day camp, which is
technically
almost like
had 2 weeks.
It's like a half week almost.
Yeah, that's true.
Actual campers here, but we had orientation and all that happening.
But actual resident camp.
Camp. We had 1 full week of grade schoolers here, and this next week we're going to have a bunch of middle schoolers run in.
Yes, indeed. They just keep getting older.
It's just going to keep getting even more exciting. So
That's right. Well, hey, if you listened last time, we've had Mr. Roy Hodson in with us, and he's back again for part 2, taking us through kind of the history of Camp Nathanael, Scripture Memory Mountain Mission. Mm-hmm. And Roy, first of all, welcome back.
Good to be back.
And the last time, we're going to get straight into it because there's obviously a lot to talk about in a short period of time.
And if you haven't listened yet, you said if they have listened. If you haven't listened to the episode before this, go into the app that you're listening to and go back an episode because it's going to give you a lot more
that's
context
right.
to the story.
Absolutely. You know, go visit the prequel first. All right? Go back to the original episode and then come and get caught up here. But when we left off, we actually in the first episode really we were talking about the early stages. You know, we're in our 92nd, almost 93rd year of ministry at Scripture Memory Mountain Mission, and you took us all the way back to the origin. It was the origin story is what it was. All right,
we were founded officially, I guess, on the paperwork and everything. We put 1932, but you were talking about stuff from the 20s.
Correct, because
people coming that early down here.
Folks here in the mountains doing ministry.
And so you brought us up to roughly we kind of ended talking around 1935, 1936, because they had moved from the early, those first times, that first year of camp in Leslie County over in Hyden, and Central Presbyterian churches where they were.
Correct.
And then they moved to the campus that we're on now. And over here in Emelina, they bought it from the Mosleys. Was that correct?
Mary Mosley was the widow who owned the farm.
Right. And they ended up buying the farm for $5,000 at the time.
They bought a portion of the farm, which was 66 acres.
Right.
She retained part of it, which eventually became part of camp.
Okay. And even Mary Mosley was the one who would actually cook for the campers for the first couple of summers, right?
For them. And I think I'm virtually positive the mission probably paid her a small salary stipend or whatever. Obviously bought all the materials for the food. But,
right.
But yeah, she had a part in that very early week or these summers.
And so those early summers, we're talking primitive camping, man. We're talking about setting the tents up, all of that stuff. Yeah. So here we go, Roy. We're over here now. Now we were talking before we came on the air. So the question kind of would be $5,000. You know, obviously in terms now, that'd be. I mean, that was a lot of money back then. All right. So how did they pay for that land?
Well, it is an interesting story because when they agreed to purchase the land, they had already had 2 summers here, and the story is told that the full-time staff, and maybe some of the summer staff had come. Not sure about that part, but they were sitting around an open fire down here on the bottom on wooden benches, probably put on stumps, not necessarily concrete blocks. Mm-hmm. And Mr. Franklin said he had an announcement, and he had received in the mail that day a check for that amount.
Are you kidding me?
And so literally, how he shared it with me and others did, they literally passed that check all the way around the circle because virtually nobody in that circle had ever seen a check for that amount of money.
That much money, yeah.
And I don't know if it was that night or very quickly afterwards, that is where the name Camp Nathanael came from because Nathanael means gift of God.
Wow.
And that's where Nathanael came into existence, and that's how that name was chosen. It was not, some contest.
I don't know how familiar either of you are with George Mueller, and I'm getting a lot of Mueller-esque vibes from hearing these stories and whatnot, because talking about just praying in faith, not having, but knowing that God would provide, and that's kind of the theme of what we're seeing.
It's interesting you would bring up George Mueller, because I've often thought about him over the years that I served as director, because as an organization, I don't know what the mailing list is now, but it was only a few thousand names that we ever had on the mailing list.
Do you know what the mailing list is now? You deal with a lot of that stuff.
I do. I think it's somewhere between 1,500, 2,000.
Yeah,
probably right now.
Good deal.
So it was always very small, and yet, and I don't know when this policy was put into practice, but from the very early days, they committed to never going into debt for any project, anything that they did with the ministry.
And you look at and I share that with people a lot because I always run into people that, some people even locally who have never even been here, when they come here on campus, like when we have like the soccer program that we're doing now, and people come in here, we get to talk to a lot of families, and like, man, I've never been over here before. I mean, the facilities here are incredible. And then we always get to go back and share that story, how, the amazing thing is campus never went in debt. Right. For anything, that they always trust that God will provide, and God does, and then they're able to move forward. And so,
and God has always honored that, and at some future program, perhaps we can get into some of the projects that in the more modern era, where we saw God do. This is not just a story that God did in the 30s and 40s. This is a story that God continued to do even today.
Absolutely,
yeah. As things have continued with that type of thing.
All right, so we've got where we believe we
bought the land.
the land's been bought. The name Camp Nathanael has its origins as a result of that whole whole thing potentially. So let's go.
Well, now that they own the property, they decided to do some upgrades.
Okay.
So the first summer, the upgrade was wooden platforms instead of straw ticks on the ground.
Okay.
All right.
And
stepping up in the
we
world.
had a good friend. Her name was Joy Sturgill Terhune, and Joy grew up in Hyman. Her family were business people in Hyman, but she came to camp. She's the one that told me she was here for the first camp on the straw ticks on the ground. But she was here for the second camp, and she was quite pleased to tell me that yes, they upgraded and we didn't have to sleep on the ground anymore. But they also built a rough dining and kitchen area, which was a screened-in shelter with sawdust floor and rough wood benches, and a little kitchen where they had wood stove cooked, because there's no electricity in here yet.
Yeah.
And so I'm not sure exactly when electricity came, but for several summers. In fact, they stayed in tents until probably the mid-40s.
Okay.
Before they began to build cabins.
All right.
So the first decade of ministry here through camp was the more primitive tent camping.
During that whole time, they swam in the creek. Down where the swinging bridge is, there was a deep hole. They call it the blue hole.
There's a lot of deep holes in this creek.
And that's where they would swim. And then different places they would do their bathing,
Okay.
But that's how they did it. There was not water here until sometime in the 40s. And this again is one of those God miracles. People have heard me tell this story so many times, but when they decided to drill a well, I think they had $75, I think was the dollar figure, to drill this well. So the well driller comes in and he says to Mr. Franklin, "Where do you want me to drill?" And Mr. Franklin says, "Well, you're the well driller. You tell me where to drill."
Really?
And he said, "Mr. Franklin, I can't see into the ground any further than you can, so you tell me where you want this well drilled." Again, just like with the silk stockings, Mr. Franklin said, "I literally looked up and prayed, Lord, show me where to put this well." And he literally turned and pointed to where the well is today.
Wow.
And so they drilled that well, cased it off for $74.98.
I mean, I know we don't have
two pennies left.
I know we don't have time to figure out what that would cost today, but still, I mean, it's just crazy. It really is. 2 pennies less.
2 pennies less
than what they had.
And this is the well that's still here.
This is the well that's still here.
When you come to camp today and you go down to the dining hall and you get a glass of water, it's from this well, from what I'm understanding here.
Exactly. It's the same well. Now, the quality changed over the years, and there's been other regulations where the states asked us to chlorinate and stuff, but those are all very, very recent.
Right, yeah.
And when the original first swimming pool was built, which is where the picnic shelter is, they needed to decide whether they had enough water, so they literally pumped that well onto the ground for several days and could not pump it out.
Wow.
And so they decided they had enough to fill a swimming pool. So, but yeah, that well, as you just said, Lee, it's the same well, hundreds of thousands of gallons a year come out of that well. And that's why camp has always been so protective of blasting around.
Yeah.
And some of the things like that. And so, but God, it's just a river under there that they tapped into with God's plan. So
wow, so that's crazy.
But yeah, the just thinking about those types of things, God did a lot of things materially for camp. Mm-hmm. They built cabins. Peru and Israel were the first 2 cabins.
That's interesting for those of you who have been to camp over the years. Just so you know, Peru and Israel were the first 2 cabins ever built on property.
And then Cuba came after that, and then India, and then somewhere in there, the original Alaska was constructed. Alaska was constructed somewhere in the early 50s, if I'm not mistaken, the original Alaska.
Now, was the original Alaska for campers?
Well, it was built to use for campers, but the goal had been to establish a Bible school here.
Okay, because I'm talking, in size difference based on something like Peru or Israel.
Which is why those of you who ever experienced the old Alaska as a camper, why there were multiple rooms with a hallway. It was set up almost like a college,
like a
dorm
school,
or
a
boarding school type.
Good
facility that never materialized as far as that school went. But in the 40s, the county did have a school here called Nathanael School, public school, that was here actually in this lower level of the chapel was the classroom. And they also had a classroom where the shelter is now, but they had a building there, the original Kentucky building.
Now you said the county had a school, but was that established through Scripture Memory Mountain Mission? Since it was called Nathanael School?
Yes, it was. Okay. But similar to what they did at Cordia, somebody else provided the facility.
Got it.
And they paid the teacher.
Got it. Okay.
But the teacher, I think, was hired through Scripture Memory Mountain Mission.
Okay.
So I don't remember exactly how many years they had that school, but several, probably 10 at least, up until probably the mid to early 50s.
Wow.
Somewhere in the 50s. So that met here and on the grounds as well. So, but as they began to build, then they in the 40s they built the chapel. Mm-hmm. And again, there's a story behind the stone of this chapel. All of this stone was hand quarried right here on this property. Some up Old House Branch, some down on Troublesome, just below, around where the climbing tower is now. They brought it all in here on sleds, and then they hand carved it basically under, right here on the site, and then put it up block by block. Dr. Mangiardo, his grandfather, was part of the Italian crew of masons that put this building up.
Any idea how long it took them?
No.
Okay. I was getting ready to say that's
it
interesting.
It was built in stages partly for money,
Right.
partly, but for time as well. They built the lower level first and roofed it.
Gotcha.
And when it was completed, they used it for a dining room as well as a school at that point.
Those are the stories that I heard.
Right.
That I work in the office here in the bottom of the chapel, and I know that when I sit down at my desk every day, that this used to be a dining hall.
Yeah.
Wow.
When we first came in 71, it was the dining hall, and back in the back of the building, that's where the kitchen was, and it had a homemade walk-in cooler, but anyway, that was the dining room, and then in time they put the second floor on. But it did not have the two wings. It was just a single structure with no wings on either side.
Gotcha.
The mission offices was one room, which is if you look toward the front of the chapel, it's the right-hand room, goes out where the bell, we used to ring the bell, I guess.
Okay,
That was the mission office.
That was the office. Wow. Okay.
Business office was the other little room on the other side.
Okay. Yep.
Which also doubled up later as a radio studio and also as a counseling room after chapel services. That's where they would take individuals to speak with them individually.
Wow.
So they built the top, and history is a little sketchy on this part, but the stained glass windows, when I was doing some research years ago, I tried to find in the board minutes where the stained glass windows came from.
Okay.
I can tell you where the furnace came from,
Okay.
but there's not a single notation during any of that history where they came from. But we do know.
And these are the original windows
the
that were
original
placed from the very beginning.
right
Yep.
in the 40s. And we had a speaker here several years ago whose last name was Saint, part of the Nate Saint family. The
okay,
the
yeah,
Alka Indian Saint.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
In fact, he's, I've drawn a blank on his first name, but he was a brother to Nate.
Wow, really?
And in talking with him, he spoke here for, I guess it was our spring work week. And so we were up in the chapel just talking, and he mentioned those windows, and we got to talking. And he shared, and I have no reason to doubt it, his father was a stained glass artisan in Philadelphia. And you can, reading the Saint's story, you can confirm that.
Yeah.
And he is the one who created all of these windows.
Wow.
And he is also has a window in the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C.
Is that, again, this is just a question. You said whenever a question pops into your head, you just mentioned Pennsylvania, Philadelphia is not the first time that's in the history of camp. Was that any connection from maybe the lady that came down?
Miss Houston?
Any connection there?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, I always suspected, because if Miss Houston did something, she always did it anonymously as much as she could.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha.
I kind of feel that maybe she or her family were the ones that did underwrite it, but I have no verification of that.
Yeah, it's just, you're talking about that early of a time, and then the connections with people from the same area coming down. It just, maybe.
And so I mean, here you have this stone chapel with these handmade stained glass windows, which are still here today.
Yeah.
So that became a focal point. And then they just continued to develop the facilities over time. But as they did that, the focus wasn't on building. The focus was on ministry.
Right.
As we mentioned last time, in the 40s, they were one of the first programs on WKIC out of Hazard. Another thing that they did in the 40s, the old Homestead building was originally built to house a children's home.
I was going to ask about it.
Which actually began in Combs in Perry County. Two of the mission ladies began to take in orphaned kids, or there's stories of a couple of different families.
I told you, man, a lot of Mueller vibes going on here.
Another family who literally came up to one of these two women on the street in Hazard with an infant in the dad's hands and two little kids holding on to his pants legs. His wife had died in childbirth when the infant was born. He was overwhelmed with trying to care for him. And he literally said, "Can you take my children and raise them?" And that was three. And I think at one, so they had them, but then they convinced the leadership to build a facility here. So the original homestead was built as a children's home, which again explains, if any of us that were ever in there.
If you ever in there, that was upper rooms.
The upper rooms, there was three big rooms upstairs, and there was bedrooms downstairs. The wing where the Murs lived all those years, that was an addition later.
Okay, that makes sense.
That was not part of the original structure.
And if you come to campus today, the building is not there now. There is a child care center that sits kind of right next to where the building was. But then there's a little, I guess I don't know what you call it, a porch or a deck that you can go out and sit.
And overlooking Troublesome Creek.
Overlooking Troublesome. It's used a lot now for campers when they come to have a place to sit and read the Bible and reflect on all of that.
Cabin
devotions.
And when we took down the homestead, there was a fire pit there before the flood.
Right.
And then there was also a stone, and I don't know what happened to that stone, that has the likeness of the homestead on it. Whether it's
I think the stone is still around. I know they were doing some work over there. You talk about flood recovery as they were digging up and getting flood recovery things. I think that stone is one of the ones I believe it is still sitting over there. I'd have to go double check that.
Yeah, but I think it's kind of one of those God things. Lee, you mentioned the child care center. By design, we put that there
to carry on that type of ministry,
deference to what Homestead was in its original history.
Absolutely.
So, those folks, while they were very conservative doctrinally, and believe it or not, girls were not allowed to wear slacks here until 1971.
Wow.
They had to wear skirts, even the campers. And so, but they were always forward thinking.
Yeah.
Those two ministries we talked about. In the 40s, they developed ministry to the African American community here in the mountains.
Because you got to keep in mind the time frame of all of this.
We're talking 1940s.
That's right. Yeah.
And of course, the schools were all segregated. But two of the white ladies went, but then as they came into the late 40s, again, they saw that an African American staff person would be as effective or more so.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so in the early 50s, late 40s, early 50s, a lady by the name of Nancy Johnson from Harlan County, who was a camper, came to those, excuse the terminology, but of the day, it was called colored camp, which is the term that was used.
Yeah.
She came to those camps, was saved as part of that, and then came back and worked for several years doing the visitation in the black schools across this area. And so then they developed camp for that. And they had, I'll use the correct term, African-American camp, black camp, up until the late 60s.
Wow, okay.
When segregation or integration really took hold. But the first couple of years, one of those ladies that was involved in that told me, she said, now, everybody involved in this is now passed and it's in heaven, so I can tell this story. She said, I was recording some of her remembrances, and she said, can you turn that off a minute? Sure. So I turned it off, and she said, we had a couple of years in the Red Fox community, which for those who are not familiar, Knott County, that is where the African-American community primarily was in Knott County. So they would pack up everything here at Emelina, take it over there, set it up, and have, the tents and the whole deal of camp over there. Well, after about 2 years, this lady said, this is what she had me turn it off for. She said, After about 2 years, they said, I think the men of the mission got tired of doing that. So they decided, well, we'll just have it at Emelina.
Got tired of carrying everything.
But you know, even some of those people that we talked to about that, it ended 2 or 3 years before I came. But they were still talking about how that was the premier week of the summer. Was the African American camp, the spirit, just the whole vibe. You know, Ralph Bauer, who many people would recognize that name, who worked in Leslie County for years with Camp Nathanael. He said that was his favorite time of the whole summer. And I was a little jealous of him because we missed that.
You never get to see that. So,
but then again, when integration was a real sticky point in this country, the staff and the mission made the decision, we're going to integrate.
That's because I was actually going to ask you about that, because I know when you're dealing with something on a national level, something that we look back on throughout history, and you see so many hard things that were happening right there, and just to see that the staff at that time at Scripture Memory Mountain Mission said, no, this is what needs to happen. This is where we need to be. We need to be pushing into this. Right. Man, such great news there.
Instead of backing off, they took that stand.
And that's a testament there to the staff.
That's right.
Because that they were going to get, you're going to get some backlash.
Right.
Because you are bringing people together. And it's just like, well, that's going to...
And they were
that's going to get a little. That's going to get a little bit of pushback,
right? And you have to keep in context the culture and the generations of that time. They were concerned that how the community of this end of Knott County would respond, or react to that taking place. But I can imagine that Mr. Franklin had some conversations with folks to kind of set the tone. But to my knowledge, there was never any overt pushback for sure. And
at the end of the day, what we're talking about is the gospel.
Exactly.
This is about getting the gospel out. This is about knowing that we are created in the image of God, and that Christ has died for all. Therefore, we take the gospel to all, and it is the gospel that unites us. And so, that's just incredible to think back and just to see, the encouragement to see that the staff members of that time saw how important that was.
Exactly. And way back in the 40s, when they first came to this property, they established a Sunday school here. There was a lady named Mrs. Ritchie who lived in this community, and she told Mr. Franklin she had been praying for 14 years that someone would establish a Sunday school in the Emelina community.
Wow. And
she got to see it, which developed into the Emelina Bible Church, which was a church here on the property for a period of time. But again, we can come back to this at another time.
We will, for sure.
But the people that were on staff, and I think it's been generally true with some hiccups along the way, to be honest about it, always were looking for the next thing that they could do to spread the gospel, to disciple those who needed discipling.
Praise God. And that brings us up to what year now, Roy? Where would you say we're roughly at this point?
We're probably mid-50s, but there's a couple of stories I'd like to bring us up to speed that continue today about the community outreaches that really began in the 40s.
Okay.
So
good deal.
We'll come to that another time.
Yeah, we will. So we're out of time for this episode. So we're not done with Roy. All right. There's still a lot to talk about, and we're going to get to those episodes, but those episodes will come later. We're going to get into starting in July. We're going to get into focusing on what's going on right now, right here at camp, and that's summer camp. That's summer camp, man. We're going to be talking to some of our summer missionaries and letting you kind of get backgrounds on them and learning their experience, so that maybe someone who's listening to, or you know someone who would be interested in serving as a summer missionary here at Camp Nathanael. And you've gotten the opportunity to listen to just the rich history of what God has done here over these past 2 episodes and in episodes to come. So, Roy, thank you so much for sitting down with us.
Well, thank you, Stephen and Lee. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Good deal. Lee, you got anything, man?
Not a whole lot right now. We're just we're in the middle of summer, so there's everything is happening. It's like, do you have anything? And I'm like, I have too much right now.
Way too much.
It's summer camp. There's all kinds of things happening.
Well, guys, listen. There's still, like I said, June 15th. There's still maybe some time to get in if your week of camp hasn't happened yet. I know we got high school week coming up in a little bit. Got family camp coming up. You're welcome to commute in. All the information on that can be found at campnathanael.org, or you can call us here at the office 606-251-3231. We'll be happy to answer any of your questions. With that, man, we gotta get back to summer camp, and then we'll be back in a few weeks.
We'll be back with some summer missionaries.
Awesome, sounds good, guys. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time on the Voice of Camp Nathanael.